Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Stewart. I'm the CEO of TDi Sustainability. Looks like we have a good participation today, and from the poll, looks like the majority of the people from industry, and interesting to see that poll response about the level of concern regarding the minerals and metals in the renewable energy supply chain. Which is perfect for us because we're here today to talk about the findings from a recent report that we published, that the TDi team published on responsible sourcing considerations in the clean energy transition, and in particular, the renewables industry, both wind and solar. The report, we set out to have a summary guide for producers and purchasers of clean energy and renewables in particular. And we examined some of the key challenges that lie in minerals and metal supply chain, which my colleagues will talk about a little later. And I'm joined by those colleagues here today from TDi, Soledad Mills and Zandi Moyo. And together we're going to introduce the report, summarizing the key challenges and responses to those challenges that we've identified, and we work with actually very often with our clients. We'll then have a panel discussion, and I'm joined by two guest panelists alongside Zandi and Sol. Jennifer Turner from Equitable Origin. She is the energy director, and EO is a standard-setting organization, amongst other things, and they've just recently published their consultation version of their standard on wind and solar. And then Joel Freyhoff, we're very lucky to have him to come and join us as well for questions, who is from Ørsted, the global energy utility. We've also set aside time for audience questions and answers at the end of the panel session. Just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and the link will be available on our social channels, and if you registered, we'll send it to you there. So let me start a little bit by setting the scene. I think we can all agree that the clean energy transition is now unstoppable. Energy from wind is growing around 10% annually, adding an extra 80 gigawatts per year. Solar energy is forecast to be the world's largest single source of electricity by 2027. And furthermore, the renewables are known to be by far the cheapest form of energy for the future. So the solid economics of solar, the heightened need for energy security in a world that is beginning to look more and more scary in the terms of geopolitics and conflicts and growing protectionism, make it difficult, we think, to resist this already progressive path. I think most people would agree that's a good thing. It's a major contributor, of course, to our race to combat the biggest issue of our time, which is climate change and the effects of climate change on many of our populations. And our young people are experiencing the greatest anxiety ever recorded, with more than 60% of people under 18 claiming to have climate anxiety. But despite this positive outlook, and we should all be optimistic, the industry is not without its shadows. And we, the industry, our elected parliaments and our citizens all face the uncomfortable reality that there are some challenges that we need to address, some trade-offs. Let me just mention a couple of those. One of those trade-offs is energy independence versus reliance on China. We're being supplied by vast amounts of cheap solar modules, for example, from China, which is a good thing for households wanting to invest in solar and to reach our goals for net zero. The biggest cost is now installation, but it's not such a good thing for Western businesses who are facing challenges to stay afloat amongst these cheaper imports. The USA tariffs on renewables are up to like 40%, but still are cheaper than those that can be produced in that country. Another trade-off, net zero emissions versus the potential of unmanaged adverse impacts on people and planet further up the supply chain. Renewables are a massive contributor to our national goals to meet the net zero, of course, but there are metals and materials needed to manufacture those modules, and those don't come without some risks that need to be managed. So the world is committed to come out of hydrocarbon. We're moving out of an oil era, but we're moving into a new age of minerals. So put it plainly, the clean energy that we aspire to generate and power our houses and our businesses will require an estimated 3 billion tons more of metal to produce the clean energy that we need. So for purchasers and producers of clean energy, there's some key priorities that they must do to facilitate this path to a cleaner future, but also to manage some of those challenges. First of all, we've got to ensure that the production of this clean energy technology doesn't cause harm to people and the environment at the same time, the unintended consequences. And also that generating the energy to produce these inputs into the materials that we use, the machines and equipment that we use for clean energy, doesn't itself eclipse that advantage by creating more greenhouse gases in its manufacturing processes. So these are the ESG risks, environmental and social governance risks, that supply chain managers and procurement teams have to address routinely. And as well, the regulatory burden is mounting in response to this, in response to civil society's alarm around some of these risks. And we can see since 2010, when the Frank-Dodd Act in the United States was first enacted to really kind of raise alarm and to get companies to be more cognizant of the potential of conflict minerals in their supply chain, has grown almost exponentially. And this is no longer something which is going to happen in the future. This is happening now at the end of last year, and companies are having to report and demonstrate that they are taking action when they find risks in their supply chain. So with that background, we wrote the Material Change for Renewables report. We actually written a similar report in 2018, 2019 called Material Change, which is for the auto and electronics industry. But we thought it would be good to update this and focus it on the renewable sector directly. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Zandi Moyo, who is going to talk about some of those ESG risks in some of those materials that we've identified are prominent in the supply chain. Zandi.
Thank you, Assheton. So in Material Change for Renewables, we approach environmental, social, and governance risks by analysing 22 ESG issues. And we think that these issues are important because they give an accurate set of indicators on supply chain risks that companies are being asked to analyse, monitor, and take action to avoid. So to assess these ESG risks in solar and wind supply chains, we look at the strength of association of these 22 ESG issues with the production of 17 minerals and metals. And by strength of association, what we mean is the likelihood that these materials could be linked to these issues. So we chose these 17 minerals and metals as they are key to the production of solar panels and wind turbines, and because they form the main composition of materials needed to produce these technologies, and also are predicted to meet future demand for materials needed to produce these technologies. But yeah, looking at this matrix, which provides a summary presentation of our main findings, we see that the ESG landscape is complex, and that the ESG issues are not confined to a few topics. There are many issues in these supply chains that producers or buyers of renewable energy technologies should be concerned about. And a few that jump out are, because they have a high likelihood of being found in production of many of these materials, are pollution and negative biodiversity or conservation impacts, as well as many social issues such as company community conflicts and child labour. So while we try to present this in a way that is pragmatic and easily understood, but is also backed by robust data, there's a lot to think about. And looking at a generalized overview of a single point data for risk mitigation might fail to understand the context and provide meaning for decisions. So to provide this context and help the user understand what they should really be aware of so they can take action, we provide profiles on 3 key materials: aluminium, steel, and silicon. And we selected aluminium and steel for the key roles they play in both wind and turbine solar panel production. And silicon we selected due to its importance in solar panels and the topicality of ESG issues associated with its production. So what is important to know about aluminium? First, we can look at the supply chain. Aluminium comes from a rock called bauxite, which is then turned into alumina and eventually into aluminium. And it's used, in the case of renewables, for supporting structures and frames, for casing components, and for wiring. And there are different ESG risks in different parts of the supply chain that we need to consider. At the mining end, bauxite is often found in shallow deposits, which means quite a lot of surface area needs to be taken away to get at the bauxite rock, and it typically is mined at an industrial scale. So what you'll find is that bauxite is often associated with deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and degradation. And when this happens, there's also possible link with the displacement of and disruption of Indigenous people and local communities, as a lot of these mining areas are remote and located in areas where Indigenous people have their territories. So recent reports have linked bauxite mining with human rights and community conflicts, such as in parts of West Africa and Brazil. Also at the mining stage, we find that the alkaline residue produced by bauxite mining can be highly polluting if it leaks from storage lakes. But another thing to consider and know about aluminium is that to convert bauxite into alumina and alumina into aluminium takes a significant amount of energy. And about 80% of this aluminium is processed in China, where it is powered by coal fire. So for these reasons, we see that greenhouse gas emissions have a strong link with aluminium. And because of this, the aluminium sector is responsible for about 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions each year. And you tend to find that some companies are relocating to places where there's a growing amount of hydropower energy available. But the good thing about aluminium is that it's highly recyclable and its recycling rate has gone up, although there is still room to grow. But yeah, that's aluminium. Let's look at steel now. So steel is mined from iron ore and is then typically smelted to produce pig iron, which is then refined to produce steel. And it's used in solar and wind technologies for supporting structures, for building foundations and casing components in wind turbines. While steel is linked with similar ESG issues as aluminium, the production of iron ore is not inherently more environmentally or socially harmful than most other types of mining. But what we see is that the sheer scale of iron ore mining, with more than 917 mines operating globally, means that negative impacts are more widely reported. And in comparison to aluminium, just to put this into context, we see that 23 times more iron was produced in 2022 than aluminium. So that's 1.6 billion tons of iron ore. And there have been a number of high-profile events related to iron ore mining in recent years, which have caused media attention. To name a few, this includes the collapse of a tailings dam in Brazil in 2019, which killed 270 people and released toxic mining waste into soils and waterways. And in response to this disaster, the global industry standard for tailings management assurance system was developed, and a global database of tailings dams was established. But another example of this is with links to Indigenous people's rights violations. An example that comes to mind is the widespread outrage that came after the destruction of the Juukan Gorge Cultural Heritage Site in Australia in 2020. And this was a sacred site for the Kurama Indigenous peoples. But the good thing about steel and most of the salient issues that occur at the local level is that they can be mitigated by strong mine site management systems, although this isn't always the case in practice. But further along the supply chain, another thing to consider is that we find steelmaking is linked to greenhouse gas emissions, and this is because iron ore is most commonly smelted in coal-burning furnaces. And to add on to this, further carbon emissions are released when carbon in pig iron is removed to make steel. But overall, we see that iron and steelmaking makes up to 9% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And again, we see that this production in China has a massive influence on greenhouse gas emissions of steel, which is why China is now pledging to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions from its steel industry, aiming to be carbon neutral by 2050. And they plan to do this by shutting down the most outdated and polluting plants. However, this could have impacts for the supply of steel in future. But moving on to the last profile that we took a dive into in the report is silicon. So when it comes to silicon, the strongest association with ESG issues occurs at the manufacturing stage rather than the mining stage, unlike most mined materials. Here we see that forced labor is the critical ESG issue to consider, which reflects the numerous reports of forced labor rights issues in polysilicon manufacturers in the Xinjiang region of China. Polysilicon is a form of, but just to look at the supply chain, polysilicon is a form of elemental silicon made up of small interlocking silicon crystals, and it's an important input material for the photovoltaic cells in solar panels. Some public reports that claim polysilicon manufacturers in Xinjiang either participate in Chinese government labor displacement practices or are supplied by companies that do so. This is why we see legislation trying to address this, such as the Uyghur Forced Labor Act in America and other forced labor laws that are coming up in Europe. But another important thing to know about silicon is that while only a moderate association with greenhouse gas emissions is currently found, studies predict that these emissions could rise sharply in the coming years as solar panel production ramps up. So our analysis of these 3 materials and summary analysis of the 17 materials shows that the ESG landscape is not limited to just a few topics, but is complex. And there are multiple ESG issues that in these supply chains that procurement managers should be concerned about. So how should companies respond to these? I'm going to hand over to Sol to talk about this.
Thank you, Zandi. As Assheton and Zandi have highlighted, the regulatory burden associated with responsible sourcing is growing at pace. And while some regulations are selective about the minerals they cover and ESG risks that companies are required to disclose on and report on, new and emergent regulations like the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD, are often far broader. So to source responsibly, companies should take a comprehensive view and seek to identify, avoid, and address potential and actual adverse ESG impacts. Setting up a supply chain due diligence management system involves several key steps. The first step would be to define the objectives of the due diligence management system, including ensuring compliance with regulations, mitigating risks, promoting sustainability, and upholding ethical sourcing practices. It may also involve engaging with stakeholders, including customers, investors, suppliers, employees, NGOs, and external partners and experts to identify expectations regarding ESG issue relevance and performance. The next step is to develop clear policies and procedures outlining the requirements for due diligence, supplier assessment, monitoring, and reporting. Establishing thresholds for conducting additional or enhanced due diligence where risks are identified will help companies to target limited resources towards high-risk supply chains. Engaging with suppliers to communicate ethical sourcing practices and expectations throughout the supply chain is essential. And in order to understand risks associated all the way upstream, it's important to cascade requirements down the supply chain and establish visibility and traceability to identify the country of origin of raw materials. At the same time, companies should conduct a comprehensive risk assessment of their supply chain to identify potential risks such as human rights violations, labor issues, environmental impacts, and corruption, all of which is now a part of many mandatory due diligence regulations. Companies need to carry out due diligence on suppliers to verify their compliance with relevant regulations and standards, which could include, for instance, researching company history and ownership, reviewing documentation, sending questionnaires, conducting site visits, and engaging with stakeholders. Companies should define the frequency of due diligence to regularly assess supplier performance through periodic reviews, questionnaires, and audits. Any identified non-compliance issues should be addressed through remediation measures such as corrective actions, training, and capacity building initiatives. Companies need to establish mechanisms for reporting and transparency, including regular reporting on supplier performance, risk assessments, and compliance status, which is also a requirement of the CSRD. And lastly, it's important to continuously review and improve your supply chain due diligence management system based on feedback, lessons learned, and changes in regulations or industry standards. Industry or multi-stakeholder voluntary ESG standards and frameworks reflect and can also help companies anticipate this broadening of ESG issues of concern and expectations of supply chain due diligence. In the report, we've published a matrix of voluntary standards that provide coverage of a broad range of ESG risks relevant to the mining of minerals for wind turbines and solar panels. By encouraging suppliers to adopt these comprehensive standards, producers and purchasers of clean energy can have some assurance that the company has been verified for their management of and performance on prevailing ESG issues. The matrix also includes some issue-specific standards that are more in-depth in their requirements and focus on particular ESG areas. The two newest standards are the Solar Stewardship Initiative's ESG standard and Equitable Origin's standards for renewable energy development. The draft EO 100 standards for wind and solar were launched last month and are the only comprehensive standards specifically designed for the evaluation of ESG performance at renewable development sites and their supply chains. We'll hear more about them from Jennifer Turner at Equitable Origin as part of our panel session shortly. Some of the tools that can support risk identification and management include TDi Digital's online platform, which can help companies quickly identify those standards and regulations most relevant to their sourcing operations and ESG risk exposure. The Integrated Compliance Assessment tool can be used to benchmark a company's own standard and quickly compare multiple standards simultaneously. Finally, producers and purchasers of clean energy can support responsible sourcing by engaging directly in initiatives that seek to improve environmental and social conditions upstream and to promote responsible procurement of clean energy. For example, the Fair Cobalt Alliance works with small-scale producers in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to improve conditions in cobalt mining areas and is directly supported by companies throughout the supply chain, including Tesla and Google. The Solar Stewardship Initiative was established by Solar Power Europe and Solar Energy UK to enhance transparency and promote responsible production, sourcing, and stewardship of materials in the solar value chain. The Solar Stewardship Initiative works collaboratively with manufacturers, developers, installers, and purchasers across the global solar value chain and is currently in the process of becoming a multi-stakeholder initiative. The Clean Energy Buyers Institute's Beyond the Megawatt initiative seeks to maximize the environmental and social outcomes of the clean energy transition by leveraging the influential demand of energy customers through the procurement of clean energy that is resilient, equitable, and environmentally sustainable. And they have a number of tools on their website to help clean energy purchasers conduct due diligence in their supply chains. As has been the case in other sectors, the greatest impetus for change builds when companies with a common purpose, such as buyers of clean energy, act collectively. Coordinated action and ESG expectations from buyers can ensure consistent messaging to suppliers and allow buyers' resources to be pooled to target improvements more effectively, which in turn ensures that suppliers can more easily and efficiently demonstrate how they are meeting buyers' ESG expectations. And now I'll hand it back to Assheton to take us into the panel.
So thanks, Sol and Zandi. That was great. I mean, I think you managed to give us a kind of a glimpse of the vast amount of data that is out there on ESG and adverse news and circumstances in these supply chains, in the mineral supply chains. And I think one thing which is always difficult to do in a short panel like this is to demonstrate how we can make sense of that through the systems that we built, and also to provide that context. And so Zandi tried to, in the time available, talk about the context of these things, because of course, a single point data doesn't give you the whole story. We need to contextualize that. And Sol too, and in the report, you know, we've identified quite a number of different certification systems which do cover these supply chains, but the number of different frameworks which are out there are vast. And another thing that we are very dedicated to at TDi Sustainability is making sure that our clients have a way to demystify which ones of those apply, and that's through our integrated compliance assurance tool. For those of you who are viewing, just in case you haven't noticed, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A tab. So please do go on there and post your questions, and they will be fielded by our team, and we can address them to the different panelists, which is a nice segue to bring on the panelists and add to the team here, Jennifer from Equitable Origin. Jennifer Turner, who is the energy director at EO. So yes, can I ask you to switch on your videos, and we can start the panel. And perhaps I could start with Jennifer. I'm not sure if I can see Jennifer. Let me just kind of scroll across. Yes, I can now see Jennifer, which is great. Jennifer, Sol mentioned EO. Tell us a little bit about Equitable Origin, and in particular the new standard which is out for consultation now on wind and solar. How does that fit in? We've been talking a lot about supply chains and metals and minerals, but Equitable Origin is at the other end of the supply chain. Please tell our participants, our viewers, a little bit about what EO aims to do and how it can change their lives.
Absolutely. Well, it's wonderful to be able to join this discussion today and take part in this important conversation. A little bit of information, I'll start more broadly with Equitable Origin and why we do what we do. So we are a nonprofit, and our mission is to partner with, I would say, a broader set of stakeholders to collaboratively work towards more responsible energy development and to drive improvements in, I think, a field that can often be quite problematic. Equitable Origin was founded back in 2009 and spent a full 3 years developing our first standard through engagement with many stakeholders and rights holders, and we've been iteratively building on that ever since. And so coming back to why this is important, you know, Ashton, I really liked how you opened with talking about the unintended consequences of resource development, which I think are fairly ubiquitous and across the board. You know, many of the same issues that we're seeing in oil and gas are to a certain degree being replicated, but yet unseen with renewable energy projects. And another thing that kind of a common tie that I think extends to all of these developments is the urgency with which we need to create change. There is a dire and urgent need for that. And when we think about how to achieve that, I don't really think it's possible until we have a system that we collaboratively contribute to, that offers a line of sight in a way that's connected to the impacts that these projects have on the ground, and that recognize companies that are engaged in better practices. And so in that way, it's our hope to make better practices more competitive and generate better outcomes in that process throughout the life of a project. And this part, I think, is really important in a way that's tied on an ongoing basis to impact or input from impacted communities themselves. It's work that's really personally important to me. You know, so I speak from extensive experience here. I've spent over a decade working on drilling rigs in Canada. And, you know, we're known as to have some of the highest standards in the world. And yet I've almost died in this work. I have known people who have died in this work. And so it is very clear to me then that resource development is tied very deeply to human rights issues and abuse in a way, you know, and I appreciate how you raise this, Ashton, in a way that is so unseen. And so that really does tie into the importance of certification and an approach that comes as close as we can to seeing that full picture. So coming back to the draft standards for wind and solar, you know, we have these same, you know, just like I talked about, some commonality in these issues. We do have the same core principles that guide all our work at Equitable Origin. You know, we have in these 5 principles, we've got community engagement and human rights, Indigenous people's rights, occupational health and safety. And, you know, to build on Zandi's remarks, you know, it is very true that Indigenous communities in particular, I think, have expressed frustration with a lack of recognition for Indigenous rights and the related expectations for engagement and partnership building, relationship building with communities. It's not just a challenge, but when we think about how to, you know, develop these projects better, you know, these projects themselves would benefit from a better understanding of cumulative effects pathways, like a more holistic view of the impacts of development. We talk a lot about regulatory compliance and regulatory pathways, but I don't really think there is much recognition for Indigenous-led cumulative effects assessments. And that can only really come from ensuring that those perspectives are integrated directly. So that's really why we see an important role in certification, and really collective intelligence that, you know, really defines what is better and what isn't. So coming back to our work in wind and solar, I know I've talked for a while here, but we are about, this is really only as strong as everyone that comes to the table to collaboratively build it. So, you know, that includes, I think, you know, I would like to think many people here, we're about 5 weeks into an 8-week consultation period. So it'll end on May 31st. And, you know, one of the things I think that makes EO special is that collaborative framework and multi-stakeholder focus. You know, our standards do reflect this. So if you're interested in commenting or contributing, that would be really wonderful. You know, Kaki Comer, who has done so much work to really kind of take leadership with the development of our technical supplement in wind and solar. She's here in this event. She'll be adding the link to the draft standards for your review and an opportunity for feedback right in the chat. So there's my there's my plug, and I hope I've covered the answers for your questions.
As always, very well indeed. But let me ask a couple of follow-up questions here. What many people might not know about EO is, as well as the standard work that it's been doing, it also works a lot in the field with Indigenous peoples too. In fact, it was built around that multi-stakeholder and very inclusive model that you mentioned. And also you mentioned that Equitable Origin has been developing these standards since 2009. So let me try and collapse kind of 2 questions into one. When you're convincing companies to come on board and adopt the EO, what is the business case? What are the benefits that they can see from a standard like EO and the EO in particular? And similarly, when you're talking to Indigenous peoples and communities around renewables and gas projects, how do you convince them that this is going to enable them to hold the developers to account? What's their business case?
I'll start with communities first, because I want to start with what's important, or what I consider to be more important. Communities are naturally, I think, apprehensive of any group or entity that is in this space. There are a lot of, or even directly tied to resource development. This is especially true for Indigenous communities. And as I think we've gotten a little bit of a reflection here today, but it is worth getting a deeper understanding of it. There are many excellent reasons for that. And so, the same principles that we aim to uphold in external stakeholders, we really try to turn the mirror back on ourselves and uphold them internally as well. So, really we work to relate, engage in relationship building and work towards partnerships. And really, I don't rely on, in Indigenous space and Indigenous communities, I don't rely on people to trust what Jen Turner or what any of us say about equitable origin or the value of that. That'll really ultimately be defined by Indigenous communities themselves, Indigenous leaders themselves who are engaging in that process or seeing how their communities can have an input into a framework, finally, for once, that gives them a direct say into saying what is better versus what is worse, versus a better that is kind of defined from the outside in, a bank in London, that doesn't really integrate their perspective or the impacts that they're facing on the ground. For companies, I think so far, our early uptakes have been, I think, companies that are really already engaged more in sustainability and looking for a way to authenticate that story and prove that story, which is, I think, from the outside looking in, very difficult to differentiate from greenwashing. So then how do you tell the difference? And that can only really happen through some form of external and independent assessment that is transparent and accountable and publicly visible. The framework for that, by definition, if it's going to work for the public, it can only really be collaboratively built and tied to this kind of community input. If we do that correctly and get recognition for it, which I think is really starting to happen. I think this is kind of how we win together. We ensure in the process that better practices become more recognized, more competitive, and hopefully drive better outcomes in a world that so sorely needs it.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I think that that trust deficit is something we're going to have to overcome if we're going to find a sustainable path forward for these much needed developments. But thanks very much, Jen. I'm sure we could go on speaking for many hours on this, but let me turn to Zandi. And Zandi, again, thank you for the presentation of the report where we took some of those materials and tried to identify and present in a coherent and comparative form the ESG, relative ESG associated risks associated with them. But of course, these aren't the only minerals and metals that supply chain managers have to procure for their renewable projects. What are the other metals, and how should we be focusing on those, or how would you advise our viewers to focus on them, and where do they go to find this data?
Thanks, Assheton. Yeah, so we singled out those 17 minerals and metals that we presented in the matrix as we think they are the most important and are a good place to start for companies. And looking at the findings, we can see that some of the materials, other than the 3 materials that we presented profiles on, have links with many ESG issues. And to name a few, copper is one that jumps out as it has strong association with many environmental and social issues and is used in both solar panels and wind turbines. Another one is tin, which is used in solar panels as a key material to pay attention to in terms of the supply chain risks that come up. And we can also look at cobalt, which is found in wind turbines and scores high across most of the ESG issues that we assessed and has also gained a lot of attention in media. And we have detailed profiles on all of these 17 materials we presented, similar to the ones on aluminium, steel, and silicon. But while this report only focuses on minerals and metal supply chains, some other important materials that are worth paying attention to are plastics and glass, which are also key to solar panels and wind turbines. And we also have profiles on these, but we'll see an importance of plastics coming up with the circularity regulations, and single-use plastics and inorganic materials are also coming into the forefront of stakeholders' minds because of this. And yeah, there are many other materials in solar panels and wind turbines that TDi maintains a database of, and we have a database of over 50 materials. But looking ahead into the future, as you mentioned, there'll be a big number of material needed to increase in production, needed to produce these technologies. So we should think about where this will come from. And these sources could also be a source of risk. For example, considering that there are trillions of tons of materials in the deep sea environment, and that there are already 30 concessions in the deep sea, half of which are owned by China. This could be a potential area for risk that would need to be considered, and that TDi is also keeping an eye on. So yeah, we have these databases, and we're also planning to launch our risk assessment mitigation tool on our risk platform that can provide valuable insights to companies.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's feels like it's going to be a never-ending list, which is almost kind of parallel to the never-ending list of regulations and ESG frameworks that Sol touched on, and some people refer to as the kind of alphabet soup. So we care about these things because we're mindful human beings, but as a company, we also have to respond to these regulations. So Sol, you know, if you're a supply chain manager and you've got this barrage of this tsunami of regulations and ESG frameworks coming at you, where do you focus? What's the most important thing here? Is there one or two or a few regulations that are kind of like the meta regulations, which cover many of the things that the other regulations cover, and the standards? Tell us a little bit, tell our viewers a little bit about how you can help them navigate this this forest of regulations that is growing around us.
I think the CSDDD is kind of that meta regulation, because it establishes far-reaching mandatory human rights and environmental obligations on both EU and non-EU companies that meet certain turnover thresholds. And these obligations will start from 2027. They apply with respect to a company's own operations and those of its subsidiaries, as well as to those carried out by a company's business partners in its chain of activities, both upstream and downstream. So it's a very broad scope. And the human rights and environmental obligations include what we've been discussing: integrating due diligence into policies and management systems, identifying and assessing actual and potential adverse human rights and environmental impacts, implementing measures to prevent, cease, or minimize those impacts, monitoring and assessing the effectiveness of those measures, and providing remediation to those affected. Another one to highlight is the EU forced labor regulation, which was just passed by the European Parliament and prohibits products made with forced labor from entering the European market, which could have a significant impact on the solar industry. Lastly, the new EU deforestation regulation will impose due diligence obligations from the end of this year, aimed at tackling deforestation and forest degradation. You may wonder why this is relevant for renewable energy supply chains, but as Equitable Origin highlighted in a recent article, there's a race for balsa wood for wind turbines, 80% of which comes from the Ecuadorian Amazon, and has led to growing problems of illegal logging, violence, and negative impacts on indigenous communities. So it seems that the regulatory burden will continue to grow, and it means that there's an increasing need to fully understand the entire supply chain of renewable energy products all the way down to the raw materials and where they come from.
Great, thanks. I mean, I started this with my opening remarks. I said that we'd be optimists, but I don't know, Zandi and Sol, if you'd make me lose my mind hearing about the complexity of the supply chains of things we've got to kind of figure out. But maybe we can get some support on that. And I want to open the floor to questions. We've already have 3 questions now in the Q&A box. Please keep adding to those, and we'll try and address those. But I'd like to invite now to join us Jörg Vreehoff, who is from Ørsted, and he's going to tell us exactly how to solve the problems, because at Ørsted he is responsible for sourcing. So I wonder, Jörg, if you tell us a little bit about yourself and Ørsted, and how, from your perspective, you are managing this complexity, and maybe give our viewers some insight.
Yes. Thank you, Ashton, and thanks TDi for the invite. Very happy to represent Ørsted on this panel on this very important topic. So I represent Ørsted as the largest, the leading offshore wind developer globally, and we have operations in the US, EU, and APAC. I work in our global sustainability team as a sustainability due diligence manager. Where I am, amongst others, leading our work on the metals and minerals program, as we call it. It has been a program which has been in place for around 3 years, and I was asked to share a bit of the challenges that we have on those, and maybe highlighting only 3, and also how we try to overcome those challenges. I think the first one is a clear lack of maturity on the topic in the renewable energy sector. I always say we are the last sector to take a seat at the table to dip our toe into these existing supply chains of key metals, and we are trying to not set up new supply chains for these metals, but rather steer a tanker into the right direction. And that lack of maturity is among my peers, but as well as with our suppliers, is kind of holding us back a little. The second is a lack of supply chain transparency, not knowing, or at least having gaps in information where these materials are originating from. They are extracted very deep in our supply chain, generally speaking. We, as an end user, are not involved in the direct purchases of these metals, and obviously not knowing and not having that transparency makes it very hard to map and then subsequently address human rights impacts. The last one is lack of leverage. I mean, even if you look at the global markets of the 3 metals that were presented, and also the ones in your report, these metals are used globally in different sectors. If you take the share of renewable energy sector, that is already a small share. If you then take even as a leading offshore wind developer globally, it's still a very small part of the market that we represent for steel and copper, for example, that end up in our renewable energy projects, making it very hard to facilitate change. So not only thinking about the challenges they will have, but how do we try to overcome that? One of the key things we've tried to do is mature the topic with our direct suppliers, just to insert this conversation on sustainability topics that we have with our first tier suppliers, and try to push them towards mapping their supply chain. That is kind of what we try to do at an individual stage, but also reflecting on some of the comments that were already made. We also seek active collaboration with others. We do that as an end user in something that's called the Dutch Renewable Energy Covenant, where we work with some of our suppliers, other developers, as well as civil society and Dutch government on this topic. And that's all that we do on our side of supply chain, but we also want to educate ourselves on what does responsible mining actually mean. So end of 2022, we joined the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA. We joined IRMA because we consider that as the most comprehensive standard. They publish all their assessment reports publicly on their website. It's a truly multi-stakeholder initiative. And one of the key points as well is they host a buyers panel, which allows us as as of yet, unfortunately, the only renewable energy company being a member of IRMA, but it does facilitate those dialogues with, for example, the gemstone sector, the automotive industry, and the electronic sector, to try to learn from them. We're trying to not reinvent the wheel, learn from their challenges, their opportunities, and then jointly trying to push this agenda forward. I'll pause there and more detail if there's any questions on that.
That's great. Thanks, Jon. And I can't agree with you more that this is such a complex topic now, and there's so many interrelationships that I think one way is to fail is to try to do this alone. So we have to reach across the aisle and the borders and the boundaries to other industries and players as well. I guess one kind of final comment before I move to those questions in the Q&A box is, you've been doing this for a while, not only in Ørsted, but also in other companies, your previous employers. It's a new industry and many new people coming into it. What's your one piece of advice? I mean, it might now be, of course, to read this excellent report, but beyond reading the excellent report, what would you advise your new incoming supply chain manager, compliance officer to do to help them to him or her to start navigating this complex world?
It's a great question, Ashton. I think it's also on the minds of many of the actors in the renewable energy sector. So besides obviously reading the TDi report, I think one of the key things is just get started. It's a very low maturity topic at the moment. It can be quite a challenge, but at the same time, there's a lot of low-hanging fruits. I think see collaboration with others. Start talking about this topic with your suppliers. That's only going to set you up for compliance with that upcoming law and regulation that you presented, Ashton, at the start. But it also positions you in a truthful manner as a front runner if you want to mitigate these actions. We have been getting questions from NGOs, but also investors around this topic, and I assume we may be one of the first companies receiving these questions, considering our size as well as our position in the market. But I cannot imagine we're the last company to receive these questions around investors. So talk to if there are any investors on the call, start including these questions in your dialogue with the companies in your portfolio, because in my opinion, this is only going to be a topic which will be maturing over the next coming years, and makes it so important that companies start including this topic in their sustainability programs.
Great, thanks, Jon. I'm just going to some of the questions that are coming in. There's one for Zandi here, which is about the data. So the questioner kind of points out or has noted that our report, the TDi report, is very much data driven. We seek out these saliency data, or we seek out the data and we do our saliency methodology. But is this data evenly distributed? Can we get equal amounts of data for all these different materials and against all the different issues that we're trying to analyze and communicate?
Thanks, Ashton. That's a good question. And I think it also ties into the previous question asked about how we verify reports of accusations, such as in the Xinjiang region. But this topic is complicated because it's not always easy to get access to accurate data, and this is something we see with forced labor. And the tricky thing about forced labor is what we call a hidden risk, and it can be difficult even if you do site audits to understand where there is forced labor. So yeah, forced labor is one of those risks that's difficult to gather data on, especially when you're looking at historical instances to base your data set on. But what we try and do at TDi is not only look at the reports of instances that are coming in, but also look at predictive analytics and try to identify the situations where forced labor is most likely to happen. And this could be based off various indices or indicators, such as in countries where there is a lot of migrant workers, or where the type of business activity needs to meet very tight deadlines, or in countries or areas that are experiencing poverty. And I think this is also a similar issue for child labor. But yeah, another thing is when we're putting together this comparative matrix of data, you're sometimes comparing different data sets, and you know, we take a lot of care at TDi to normalize this data and verify its accuracy. So this doesn't mean that they all follow the same methodology, but instead it means that we make sure that the methodology is appropriate, and the risk can be singled out and compared.
Great, thanks. Yes, and I think this thing about predictable analytics is a thing, because you know we can't go forward if we're always looking in the rear view mirror. So we're trying to understand where the hotspots risks are going to be in the future, and that is where we need indicators and indices to identify the circumstances where things might go wrong, and so we can build that into our decision making. And so one of the questions which has come up here is about, you know, the questioner is representing a company which is a developer in the UK and Europe. They are thrilled to have this information to make their life more complicated and make their supply chain more risky than they thought it was to begin with. So what do they do now? And you know, there's a lot of talk about risk-based due diligence, which is an accepted kind of path forward. What does that mean in reality, and what are your reflections on this question regarding what do you do with all this great information now you have it?
So yeah, I think risk-based due diligence is really the way to try to narrow down, try to boil the ocean, so to speak, and narrow down the approach and target resources on a higher risk suppliers. So what does that actually mean in practice? A risk-based approach to supplier due diligence involves assessing and prioritizing suppliers based on the level of risk they pose to the organization in terms of compliance, reputation, and sustainability. So rather than applying the same level of scrutiny to all suppliers, a risk-based approach allows organizations to focus their resources on suppliers that present the greatest potential risks. So the first step is what we already discussed, conducting a comprehensive risk assessment of the supply chain to identify those potential risks. And that might consider factors such as geographic location, industry sector, regulatory requirements, past performance, and potential impact on the organization. And then companies can prioritize suppliers based on the level of risk that they pose to the organization, but also to people and planet, which is the concept of double materiality and key to the CSRD. High-risk suppliers may include those operating in high-risk regions. TDi has a map of conflict-affected and high-risk areas, and there are other maps available to help companies identify what those high-risk regions are. They could also identify industries that have a history of non-compliance or are known to have worse ESG performance, or suppliers that have a significant impact on the organization's operations, or where the company is more reliant on that particular supplier and substitutability is difficult. And then the criteria for conducting due diligence on suppliers can take into account the level of risk associated with each supplier. High-risk suppliers may require more extensive or enhanced due diligence, such as site visits, assessments, third-party audits, while lower-risk suppliers may only require basic documentation review and ongoing monitoring. And once risks are identified, the due diligence process can be tailored for each supplier, which may involve gathering additional information, conducting deeper investigations, and implementing risk mitigation measures that are based on the results of the risk assessment. And these strategies for mitigating risks associated with high-risk suppliers could include, for example, implementing corrective action plans, providing training and support, establishing contingency plans to address disruptions in the supply chain, And ultimately, if no improvement is achieved, then potentially severing the relationship with that supplier. And lastly, the frequency of the ongoing monitoring of high-risk suppliers obviously should be increased in order to follow up on mitigation actions and identify any changes in risks over time. So by adopting this type of risk-based approach to supplier due diligence, companies can allocate their resources more effectively and focus on mitigating the most significant risks to ensure compliance with regulations and ethical standards throughout their supply chain.
Great, thanks. And a similar question for you, Jen, a bit of a cheeky question, I think. Developers, again, this is one of the questions, have got a lot to figure out, just trying to get their permits to get their wind turbines or their solar stands a place, I was going to say a place in the sun, which is exactly what I mean. At EO, is there a supply chain requirement in the standard? Do you also require that they look up their supply chain? How do you kind of complete the system in terms of that element?
We do have some supply chain requirements in the standard, and I will come back to saying that the power of the standard and how it's iteratively built over time through contributions from a broader set of stakeholders. But really, I think the more important point here is to envision how these pieces fit together. So, I think it is important to note that all of us here, I think we're just at a point where we really have to look for ways to kind of co-create new approaches that don't replicate past mistakes. And so to a certain degree, even when they're, let's say, perfectly built, I feel like there's an inherent limitation to frameworks or reporting frameworks, any version of even a standard or a target, any top-down approach. A certification tool is really good here because it can help fill a gap in the sense that because it's tied to collective action that is more bottom up or community driven, reflective of impacts on that scale. This is where it can integrate, the upstream or the upstream on the scene, because I do like your comment on that, Assheton, where those impacts are often unseen and unrecognized. And so when we connect that scale to these more kind of, I would say, top-down approaches, and we can kind of bridge this together when we see developers and buyers collectively back a set of siting and supply chain requirements that is more of a coordinated effort and tied to those, community impacts on the ground, then I think we have a framework or like an ecosystem where these pieces fit together that is tied to greater leverage and certainly more positive impact than any of us would ever be able to achieve otherwise.
And you told Jen a lot about what really counts as the communities and Indigenous peoples, and of course EO has been dedicated to that. One of the questions here in the Q&A box is, or I'm going to slightly adapt it and take my license to do that, is how feasible is it to have workshop with communities within the context of the standard to help them contribute to the knowledge around what is really a risk? I mean, I always think that the risk is, when we talk about risk, it's about risk to the communities. How can they contribute to the design, to minimizing risks in development, and how can that be incorporated into the standard?
There's always room for us to do more. But without that collaboration and relationship building and input from communities, in my mind, this doesn't work. And so if you don't have that line of input and that relationship, I'm not sure if you have a full view of impacts anymore. And so this does require community engagement on an ongoing basis. And some, like we've got this amazing team in Latin America that is, working with communities and having these mingas. And in the most beautiful way, we have Indigenous communities in Canada that are hearing about that and saying, oh, wow, like we see these kind of we feel this common driver here, or these deep ties. And this makes us want to engage, because certainly communities are really limited in their capacity. And so they have to kind of pick and choose. And then we have indigenous communities and tribes in the US that are looking at both of these ends and saying, well, how can our rights be more recognized? Be it by the state, be it by the feds. And so really this comes back to my point about, with connective power and moving together, all of this becomes so much more powerful. And so on that note, I don't really think we can afford to not engage, or at least relationship build with communities. And so, we have that greater collective intelligence that we can build these things on.
That's great, thanks. And I think I'm very much in need of a greater collective intelligence in my life. Before I close, I'd like to kind of throw the last question at Joel. We're talking a lot about kind of standards, and you mentioned that your company is committed to IRMA in regards to the mining and the processing and supply chain standards, or chain of custody standards. There are quite a number of standards out there. Zandi and Sol mentioned that we've analyzed, we keep a database of over 200 different standards and try and make sure we compare them. Is there a risk here that if we pick one standard only, we cause friction within the industry and supply chain? And is there room here for cross-recognition or harmonization of standards without having to select the winner or play God over which standard is best?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I mean, before joining IRMA, obviously we did a comparison of the different standards, and one of the key reasons for us to join IRMA that I already mentioned was the transparency around assessment results. It was already mentioned we need that transparency. Our stakeholders, as well as those around the mining company, need to and deserve that transparency around the assessment results, also to hold mines accountable. Other than that, obviously that buyers panel that I mentioned, facilitating that increase in leverage, that joint discussion around the topic. You raise a great point around the cross recognition. I do think there's a plethora of mining standards out there, and I'm aware of the divergence around some of these mining standards out there globally. I think there's a big need towards the convergence. For my part, from an end user perspective, I would like to mention that for us, there are some parameters that we consider that need to be met by such a mining standard, and those are amongst others the ones that I mentioned at the beginning: fully multi-stakeholder, already at board member, transparency in assessment results. In my previous job, I found out that could be one of the key reasons for critique towards the mining standard. So again, I do recognize your point, but I do think also as an end user, there are some parameters that we need to consider as a minimum that should be reflected in a cross recognition as well as in convergence of mining standards.
Great, thanks. And another talk would be good to explore what your standard is for the standards that you employ. So
of course.
But thanks. Look, I think we've got to draw it to the end, so perhaps we can go to the concluding slides. But to thank the panelists, I feel I've been on the journey right from the top of the supply chain, where we can find aluminium and bauxite rock in the forests of West Africa, right down to developing renewable energy in the US and Canada. But I think the conclusions we can draw here is that this is a complex picture, that there are many different facets of sustainable development in the clean energy transition, not least in the supply chain. And due to the regulations which are coming down the road to affect and compel companies to pay attention, there are a large range of ESG issues that we've got to better understand and how to mitigate. So it's not enough anymore just to point to the halo around the clean energy industries, renewable energy industries, solar and wind. There's also a responsibility here to recognize that we're entering into metals era, and we need to acknowledge that that also comes with some trade-offs and impacts that we got to try and reduce. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, I think a sure way to fail to achieve our goals is to act alone. This is far too complex. We got to have relationships, strange bedfellows, if you want, with companies and industries that we might not naturally do. And we need to really look at what in fact our systems are, which is now much more on the verticals, up and down the supply chain, rather than the horizontals, which is where you are located. So thank you all. Thank you for the listeners. This is a passion for TDi Sustainability. We're building up our databases on these different risks, but more importantly, on how to manage and mitigate those and actually contribute in a positive way. So thank you again. And the webinar will be recorded and will be sent on our social. And if you want to download the report, there's that funny looking square there that you can do something with your iPhone. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.